The morning of October 23, 1944. New Guinea's northern coast. Lieutenant Takeo Yoshida crouched beside a wooden crate bearing stenciled English letters, U.S. Army Field Ration Type K. His engineering unit had discovered the abandoned American supply cache 2 hours earlier, hidden beneath camouflage netting along the Sepik River trail. Around him, Japanese soldiers tore through similar boxes with desperate hands, mouths working furiously on compressed bars and canned meat, while others stuffed pockets with cigarettes and chocolate they had not seen in months. Yoshida pried open the K-ration box methodically, his engineering training demanding precision even as hunger clawed at his stomach. Inside sat 3 meal packages: breakfast, dinner, supper. Each unit contained portions that seemed impossibly generous to eyes accustomed to shrinking rice allotments. Canned ham and eggs, crackers thick with real flour, coffee that smelled rich and dark, not the burnt grain substitute Japanese troops drank when supplies arrived at all. Chocolate, sugar tablets, even toilet paper and cigarettes, as if the Americans had excess capacity for comfort in the middle of war. His hands trembled as he examined the packaging. The cardboard was waxed, waterproofed against tropical humidity. The cans were painted, marked clearly, designed for rapid field consumption without requiring extensive preparation. Everything about these rations spoke of an industrial system that had considered every detail of keeping soldiers fed under combat conditions. The label stated, each complete K-ration provided 2,830 calories. This was emergency food, the lowest quality field ration the American military issued. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yoshida had completed his officer training at the Tokyo Military Academy in 1938, where instructors had taught that Japanese soldiers possessed superior spirit, discipline born of Bushido code that would overcome material disadvantages through willpower and tactical excellence. The Americans were soft, dependent on machinery and comfort, lacking the iron determination that made Japanese forces formidable. These beliefs had sustained him through the early victories, when Japanese advances swept across the Pacific with speed that seemed to validate every doctrine. But New Guinea, in late 1944, told a different story than the one taught in Tokyo classrooms. The Japanese ration situation had been deteriorating for months. Official allocations on paper still looked adequate, specifying 790 grams of rice per soldier daily, supplemented with vegetables, fish and condiments that would provide roughly 3,000 calories. In practice, by October 1944, soldiers in New Guinea were receiving perhaps 600 grams of food per day if they were fortunate, translating to approximately 2,160 calories when supplies arrived, which happened irregularly. Often the actual intake dropped lower, much lower, as American submarines and aircraft destroyed transport vessels attempting to resupply isolated island garrisons. The mathematics were brutal. Japanese infantrymen carrying 20 to 30 kilogram loads through jungle terrain in 30-degree heat required approximately 3,500 calories daily to maintain body weight and combat effectiveness. They were receiving perhaps half that amount on good days. The deficit accumulated relentlessly. Soldiers lost weight, energy reserves depleted, wounds healed slowly when they healed at all, and tropical diseases ravaged units whose immune systems weakened from chronic malnutrition. Yoshida watched his engineering squad devour American rations with an intensity that bordered on violence. Private Nakamura was eating crackers so quickly he choked, requiring water to clear his throat before continuing. Corporal Tanaka had discovered canned fruit and wept openly while eating peaches preserved in heavy syrup, muttering that he had forgotten fruit could taste sweet instead of rotten. Sergeant Hayashi methodically opened 3 K-ration boxes, consuming the contents of each with mechanical precision, while his hands shook from something beyond simple hunger. The lieutenant forced himself to eat slowly, training asserting itself even now. The ham and eggs came from a small tin can with a key opener attached. The meat was real, processed, but genuine. Nothing like the occasional fish or mystery protein Japanese rations provided when supplies reached forward units. The eggs were recognizable as eggs, not the powdered substitute they had once received. The biscuits were dense but edible, designed to survive tropical storage while providing calories through flour and fat. The chocolate bar melted on his tongue with richness that seemed obscene given the circumstances. Around the cache site, evidence suggested an American patrol had passed through recently, possibly hours earlier. Boot prints in the mud showed the distinctive tread pattern of American combat footwear. Discarded cigarette butts bore English branding. Most telling, the supply cache appeared deliberately abandoned rather than captured, as if American forces had moved on knowing replacement supplies would arrive shortly enough that leaving this material behind cost them nothing. The implications unsettled Yoshida more than he wanted to admit. Japanese logistics in New Guinea had collapsed under pressures that compounded daily. American control of sea lanes meant transport vessels rarely reached their destinations intact. Submarines operated with impunity, sinking cargo ships loaded with rice, ammunition, and medical supplies that Japanese garrisons desperately needed. Aircraft struck remaining transport routes, destroying trucks and barges, attempting to move supplies forward from coastal landing sites. What little material arrived at ports often spoiled in tropical heat before it could be distributed to frontline units scattered across jungle terrain. The Japanese supply system relied on bulk deliveries of staple foods, primarily rice, that required cooking and preparation. This model functioned adequately during rapid advances when captured enemy supplies, supplemented Japanese stocks, and field kitchens could operate behind advancing lines. But in New Guinea's defensive fighting, surrounded by hostile forces and cut off from regular resupply, the system broke down completely. Soldiers received raw rice that required precious fuel to cook, assuming cooking equipment survived the conditions. Often they ate rice raw or barely softened in cold water, gaining calories but suffering digestive problems that further weakened bodies already stressed by malnutrition. Yoshida had witnessed the physical deterioration of his engineering platoon across recent months. Men who had arrived in New Guinea weighing 60 to 65 kilograms now weighed 50 kilograms or less. Uniforms hung loose on frames that had shrunk, ribs visible through skin stretched tight across sunken chests. Faces became gaunt, eyes hollow, movements slowed by bodies conserving energy wherever possible. The transformation happened gradually enough that soldiers adjusted to their own decline, without fully recognizing how dramatically their capabilities had diminished. American forces, meanwhile, operated under completely different conditions. The K-rations scattered around this cache represented just one component of a supply system designed for abundance. When field kitchens were operational, which happened regularly for American units, soldiers consumed field rations, Type A featuring fresh meat and vegetables, or Type B with canned and preserved foods providing 3,500 to 4,100 calories, depending on activity levels. Even when restricted to emergency K-rations, American soldiers ate nearly 3,000 calories daily, enough to maintain body weight and energy during sustained combat operations. The engineering officer examined American equipment left alongside the rations. Entrenching tools made of steel that held its edge after repeated use in coral soil that destroyed Japanese implements. Waterproof ponchos fabricated from rubberized material that actually repelled tropical rain instead of soaking through like Japanese canvas. Ammunition pouches designed with drainage holes and quick-release fasteners that allowed rapid reloading under fire. Every item reflected industrial capacity and design sophistication that considered how soldiers actually used equipment in combat conditions. His squad had been tasked with assessing captured American material whenever possible, analyzing construction methods and materials the Japanese industry might replicate. The conclusions were consistent and depressing. American equipment used steel alloys, synthetic rubbers, and manufacturing techniques that Japanese factories could not match given current resource constraints. Even when Japanese engineers understood the principles behind American designs, implementing them required industrial capabilities that Japan lacked or could not sustain under wartime production demands. Private Sato discovered another cache nearby, this one containing medical supplies, sulfur drugs in quantity, morphine syrettes designed for rapid administration of pain relief, plasma for treating shock, bandages made from cotton rather than the wood pulp substitutes Japanese medical units received when they received anything at all. The abundance was staggering, implying American forces anticipated casualties and provisioned accordingly rather than hoping soldiers would endure wounds without adequate treatment as Japanese doctrine increasingly demanded. Yoshida wrote in his field notebook, documenting the find with engineering precision, one crate of K rations containing 12 complete 3-meal sets, estimated total calories, 33,960. Enough to feed a 12-man squad for one day at American consumption rates, or feed a Japanese squad of similar size for perhaps 3 to 4 days, if they could overcome decades of dietary preferences centered on rice. The psychological impact of such abundance was difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Japanese military doctrine had emphasized spirit over material, willpower over industrial capacity, discipline over comfort. These principles made sense when fighting opponents with comparable resources. They failed catastrophically when facing enemies who possessed both superior spirit and overwhelming material advantages. American soldiers fought fiercely, defended their positions tenaciously, and advanced aggressively despite taking casualties. They also ate 4,000 calories per day, wore equipment that functioned reliably, and received regular resupply that meant ammunition, medicine, and food arrived when needed, rather than when luck permitted. The captured Australian rations Japanese forces had discovered months earlier on the Kokoda Trail had provided Yoshida's first indication of the gulf between Allied and Japanese logistics. A soldier in his company had written in a diary later captured by Australian forces, "What a feast all these things were to us. It seemed as though we had suddenly landed in fairyland. We had run out of the meager rice ration long before and had trudged on day and night eating only tasteless army crackers, which we call kanpan, with occasional wild potatoes and papayas. Here in the Papuan Mountains, the standard of living was higher than in Japan. I thought I saw something of the appalling power of Anglo-American civilization that Japan had so recklessly challenged." The words haunted Yoshida because they expressed what he increasingly felt but could not articulate while maintaining military discipline. Japan had challenged empires that could deliver ice cream ingredients to tropical battle zones because transporting luxuries cost them nothing. The same logistic systems that moved tanks and artillery moved chocolate and coffee with equal efficiency, demonstrating industrial capacity so vast that comfort items warranted space alongside combat supplies. His engineering training provided context others lacked. The lieutenant understood that modern warfare required more than courage and tactical skill. It required steel production, petroleum refining, electrical generation capacity, transportation infrastructure, agricultural surplus, and manufacturing capability operating in coordinated systems that transformed raw materials into military power. Japan possessed these capabilities in modest measure. The United States possessed them in quantities that defied easy comprehension. American industrial production in 1944 was producing 2.6 million trucks. Germany produced just over 300,000. Japan's production was lower still, hampered by resource constraints and bombing campaigns that disrupted manufacturing. But beyond simple numbers, American trucks were standardized, making maintenance and spare parts distribution straightforward. Japanese forces relied on captured vehicles from multiple nations, French trucks alongside British lorries and Polish transports and occasional German models, creating maintenance nightmares where parts rarely interchanged, and mechanics improvised repairs using materials never intended for the purpose. The food crisis was merely one manifestation of systemic inadequacy. Fuel shortages meant aircraft sat grounded for lack of gasoline. Ammunition ran low because transport vessels carrying shells never reached their destinations. Medical supplies dwindled as Japanese pharmaceutical production could not meet demand across multiple theaters, while Allied bombing reduced manufacturing capacity month by month. Soldiers wore uniforms patched together from whatever cloth remained, footwear improvised from rubber scraps and canvas, equipment held together with wire and determination. Yoshida looked at his men finishing American rations, seeing temporary satisfaction on faces that would return to hunger within days, when these supplies were exhausted. The captured cache provided a brief reprieve, nothing more. American logistics would continue delivering thousands of tons of supplies to forward units through systems Japanese forces could disrupt locally, but never truly interdict. Japanese logistics would continue failing to provide adequate food, ammunition, and medicine to troops whose courage and training could not overcome deficiencies in basic sustenance. The afternoon sun filtered through jungle canopy as the engineering squad prepared to move on, each man carrying extra American rations stuffed into packs and pockets. They would share this bounty with other units if opportunity permitted, extending the benefit across comrades who starved while fighting enemies who ate like garrison troops. Yoshida took one last K-ration box for detailed examination later, hoping to document every aspect for reports that might never reach Tokyo. Through communication networks strained beyond functionality, he understood now what the war would become, not a contest of spirit against spirit, but a test of endurance between forces operating under fundamentally different conditions. Japanese soldiers would continue fighting with discipline and courage that impressed even their enemies, but they would do so while starving, under-equipped, and increasingly isolated from supply lines that could not sustain them against opponents who grew stronger while Japan grew weaker. The outcome was no longer in doubt for anyone willing to see clearly. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The discovery at the Sepik River cache was not an isolated incident. Across the Pacific Theater, in late 1944 and into 1945, Japanese soldiers encountered American supply abundance that fundamentally challenged their understanding of the war they were fighting. Each encounter reinforced the same devastating conclusion. Japan was not losing battles through lack of courage or inferior tactics, but through systematic failures in logistics that no amount of willpower could overcome. At Biak Island off New Guinea's northeast coast in May 1944, Japanese forces had overrun American positions and found field kitchens still operating, hot meals prepared and ready for consumption. Dr. Paul Tatsuguchi, an American-trained Japanese medic serving at Attu in the Aleutians the previous year, had written in his diary about eating half-dried thistle as a delicacy, the first fresh food he had consumed in months. His final entry before American forces overran his position noted continuous suicide cases among Japanese troops who preferred death to surrender or further starvation. The contrast between his experience and the hot meals American forces ate regularly illuminated the chasm between opposing logistics systems. Japanese military planners in Tokyo understood the statistics, but failed to grasp their implications until too late. American agricultural production in 1943 exceeded 400 million tons of food annually. Transportation networks moved this abundance from farms to processing facilities to ports to ships to forward supply bases with efficiency that seemed almost wasteful in its thoroughness. Refrigeration ships carried fresh meat across thousands of miles of ocean. Ice cream production reached 135 million pounds of dehydrated mix annually by 1943, plus 80 million gallons of fresh ice cream, classified as one of 7 basic foods and distributed to all theaters, including remote Pacific islands. The United States military treated food as a strategic priority equal to ammunition and fuel. The Quartermaster Corps employed thousands of personnel focused solely on feeding troops. Supply chains were built to move food alongside combat supplies, with redundancy and backup systems ensuring delivery even when primary routes were disrupted. Field kitchens were standardized, mobile units that could be operational within 30 minutes and feed 150 to 200 men with hot meals twice daily. The M1937 field range became standard equipment, deployed wherever American forces established positions of any duration. Japanese forces lacked equivalent systems. Field kitchens existed in garrison, but rarely followed troops into combat zones where infrastructure was primitive and supply lines unreliable. Soldiers cooked individually or in small groups using personal mess tins called hango, preparing rice over small fires when fuel was available, and eating cold rations when it was not. This decentralized approach functioned adequately during peacetime or short campaigns with secure supply lines, but collapsed under the sustained operations and extended distances that characterized Pacific warfare. The Japanese High Command had anticipated a short war, victory achieved through initial strikes that would force enemies to negotiate before industrial advantages could be brought to bear. Operation planning in 1941 assumed campaigns lasting months, not years, with supplies allocated accordingly. When the war extended beyond initial projections, Japanese logistics never adapted adequately. Supply systems designed for brief intensive operations could not sustain prolonged campaigns across oceanic distances against opponents who controlled sea lanes and could interdict transport at will. Yoshida's engineering background made him acutely aware of these systemic problems. He had studied industrial production capacity, transportation logistics, and resource allocation during his technical training. The numbers told a story that Japanese propaganda could not obscure. American steel production in 1944 exceeded 89 million tons annually. Japanese production reached 7 million tons. American petroleum refining capacity was 17 times greater than Japanese capacity. Electrical generation, aluminum production, synthetic rubber manufacturing, every industrial metric favored the United States by margins that made sustained warfare increasingly one-sided as material advantages compounded over time. The food situation reflected this broader industrial disparity. American forces consumed approximately 6.2 pounds of rations per soldier daily, totaling roughly 4,758 calories for troops engaged in intensive Pacific operations. This figure was not theoretical allocation, but actual consumption documented by Quartermaster Corps records. Japanese forces on paper were supposed to receive 3,000 to 3,500 calories daily, but actual delivery to forward units rarely exceeded 2,000 calories and often dropped far below that threshold. By late 1944, Japanese soldiers in isolated garrisons were consuming as little as 600 grams of food daily, approximately 1,300 calories, assuming they received any official rations at all. Many units supplemented inadequate supplies by foraging jungle vegetation, hunting whatever small animals they could find, and cultivating small garden plots when circumstances permitted. These expedients kept soldiers alive, but could not provide nutrition adequate for sustained combat operations. The metabolic mathematics were unforgiving. A soldier carrying 25 kilograms of equipment through tropical jungle in 30-degree heat with 90% humidity burned approximately 3,500 to 4,000 calories daily through basic exertion before accounting for combat activities. Receiving half that caloric intake or less created deficits that accumulated relentlessly. Bodies consume muscle mass to compensate for inadequate food energy. Weight loss led to reduced physical capability. Weakened soldiers became susceptible to diseases they might otherwise have resisted. Wounds healed slowly. Recovery from illness took longer. Operational effectiveness declined through incremental degradation that commanders could observe but not prevent, given supply constraints they could not overcome. American military medical studies documented the relationship between nutrition and combat effectiveness with scientific precision. Soldiers maintained on adequate rations demonstrated faster reaction times, better decision-making under stress, sustained physical endurance during extended operations, and faster recovery from wounds and illness compared to malnourished troops. These advantages compounded across units, creating force multipliers that extended beyond simple numerical superiority. A well-fed American infantry company could maintain operational tempo that exhausted equally brave but undernourished Japanese defenders whose bodies lacked reserves to sustain prolonged combat. Japanese medical officers documented similar findings in reports that reached Tokyo but prompted no effective response. By mid-1944, medical examinations of new conscripts born in 1924 revealed signs of malnutrition caused by wartime food shortages affecting the civilian population. Young men entering military service already showed nutritional deficiencies that training and garrison rations could not fully correct before deployment to combat zones where food scarcity was even more severe. The Japanese nation was literally consuming itself, unable to feed both civilians and military forces adequately while prosecuting war across multiple theaters. The vitamin deficiency crisis added another layer of suffering to simple caloric inadequacy. Japanese rations centered heavily on white rice, which was preferred by the soldiers but lacked thiamine, an essential B vitamin. Brown rice, or rice mixed with barley, provided better nutrition but was disliked and considered difficult to transport. The result was widespread beriberi among Japanese troops, a disease causing nerve damage, muscle weakness, and heart problems that could prove fatal if untreated. American rations were deliberately fortified with vitamins, preventing deficiency diseases even when soldiers ate field rations exclusively for extended periods. Scurvy caused by vitamin C deficiency affected Japanese forces in areas where fresh fruit and vegetables were unavailable. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency reduced soldiers' effectiveness during darkness when much Pacific combat occurred. Pellagra from niacin deficiency caused skin problems, digestive issues, and mental symptoms that degraded unit cohesion. American forces avoided these problems through rations scientifically formulated to provide complete nutrition, reflecting Quartermaster Corps research into dietary requirements that Japanese military planners never matched. The psychological impact of hunger extended beyond physical weakness into areas affecting military performance in subtle but significant ways. Soldiers preoccupied with finding food devoted mental energy to survival rather than tactical considerations. Men who spent portions of each day foraging for edible plants or hunting small animals had less attention available for maintaining weapons, conducting reconnaissance, or planning defensive improvements. Units where food acquisition became a primary concern lost focus on military objectives as basic survival needs took precedence. Yoshida observed these changes in his own platoon. Men who had once maintained equipment meticulously now neglected routine maintenance because they lacked energy for tasks beyond immediate necessities. Soldiers who had taken pride in their appearance now wore filthy uniforms because washing clothes required effort. They could not spare. Engineers who should have been constructing fortifications instead spent time cultivating small vegetable gardens or searching jungle undergrowth for anything edible. The degradation was gradual but cumulative, transforming capable military units into survival groups whose combat effectiveness diminished daily. Japanese commanders attempted to maintain discipline through traditional methods, emphasizing duty and sacrifice, but hunger created pressures that overwhelmed conventional military authority. Soldiers stole from supply depots when opportunity permitted. Units hoarded captured food rather than sharing with neighboring formations. Men deserted positions to search for sustenance, risking execution for abandoning posts because starvation seemed a slower but equally certain death. The social fabric binding military units together frayed under stresses that doctrine and training had not prepared soldiers to endure. American prisoners of war experienced Japanese food scarcity from the receiving end, providing perspectives that highlighted the crisis from another angle. After the surrender at Bataan in April 1942, approximately 12,000 American and 63,000 Filipino soldiers entered Japanese captivity, already weakened by months of reduced rations. American and Filipino forces on Bataan had been placed on half rations after the attack on Pearl Harbor, sacrificing their supplies to support forces heading into the Pacific. By April 1942, these troops were consuming approximately 1,000 calories daily, down from 2,000 calories in January and 1,500 in February. The Bataan Death March, where Japanese forces moved these prisoners approximately 65 miles to confinement camps, became notorious for its brutality. But underlying the deliberate cruelty was a logistical reality. Japanese forces lacked adequate supplies to feed their own troops, let alone tens of thousands of prisoners they had not anticipated capturing in such numbers. The victorious Japanese army was itself hungry, surviving on reduced rations that made providing for prisoners nearly impossible, even had commanders been inclined toward humane treatment. At Camp O'Donnell, the initial prisoner facility, conditions reflected total logistics collapse. The camp was designed to hold 10,000 men, but received 60,000 Beitan survivors. Water was scarce, food minimal, medical care non-existent. Prisoners died at rates reaching 400 men per day from starvation, disease, and neglect. By July 1942, conditions had deteriorated so severely that Japanese authorities replaced the camp commander and relocated American prisoners elsewhere, a tacit admission that even by Japanese standards, the situation had become unsustainable. The irony was brutal. American and Filipino prisoners were starving in Japanese camps at the same time the Japanese soldiers were starving in the field. The difference was that American prisoners eventually received better treatment as international pressure mounted, and Japanese authorities recognized they needed prisoners for labor. Japanese soldiers received no similar reprieve, their suffering continuing until death or war's end, whichever came first. By late 1944, the strategic situation had evolved beyond any possibility of Japanese recovery through military action. American forces had established air superiority across most of the Pacific. Naval dominance was complete, allowing American ships to operate with impunity while Japanese transport vessels were hunted relentlessly. The island-hopping campaign bypassed major Japanese strongholds, isolating garrisons that could no longer threaten American operations while slowly starving in place. Logistics had become the primary weapon, more effective than direct combat in reducing Japanese military capability. Yoshida received orders in December 1944 to prepare defensive positions along New Guinea's northern coast in anticipation of American amphibious assault. His engineering platoon began work with tools that were wearing out and could not be replaced, explosives that were running low and would not be resupplied, and men who were too weak to dig fighting positions as deep as doctrine required. They did their best with what they had, which was increasingly very little. The American supplies captured at Sepik River sustained the platoon for 5 days before exhaustion. Soldiers ate with a desperation that Yoshida found simultaneously understandable and shameful. Watching men who had been trained as warriors reduced to fighting over canned fruit like starving animals. When the American food was gone, they returned to the meager Japanese rations that made maintenance of body weight impossible and watched themselves grow weaker day by day. Private Sato died in January 1945, not from enemy action, but from complications related to beriberi combined with dysentery that his weakened body could not fight. Corporal Tanaka followed in February, an infected wound that refused to heal, ultimately causing sepsis that killed him within days. Sergeant Hayashi lost so much weight that he could no longer carry his equipment, relegated to light duties that still exhausted him. The platoon was dying slowly, ground down by inadequacy in everything except courage and determination, which proved insufficient against enemies who possessed both bravery and beans. American forces never assaulted Yoshida's position. They bypassed it entirely, advancing along alternate routes while aircraft dropped occasional bombs to keep Japanese forces pinned down. The engineering platoon remained in position for months, serving no military purpose except to exist, isolated and forgotten, while the war continued elsewhere. Supplies stopped arriving altogether by March 1945. Men ate grass, tree bark, anything that might provide calories. Some died. Others grew so weak they could barely move. The lieutenant maintained his notebook throughout, documenting the decline with engineering precision. January, average weight loss per man, 3 kilograms. February, 5 kilograms. March, 7 kilograms from January baseline. Men could no longer patrol more than a few hundred meters without rest. Equipment maintenance ceased entirely, soldiers lacking energy for anything beyond immediate survival. Defensive positions deteriorated as men became too weak to perform routine upkeep. When news of Japan's surrender reached New Guinea in August 1945, Yoshida's platoon numbered 7 men from an original strength of 35. The others had died from starvation, disease, or wounds that healthy bodies might have survived. The survivors weighed an average of 45 kilograms, down from 65 kilograms when they had arrived in theater. They could walk slowly, but could not have fought effectively had anyone demanded it. Their war was over, not because Japan surrendered, but because they had been reduced below the threshold of military utility through systematic starvation that no amount of spirit could overcome. American forces eventually found them, providing food that had to be administered carefully because severely malnourished bodies could not process normal meals without medical supervision. Yoshida ate American rations again under completely different circumstances, as a prisoner rather than a soldier, defeated not by enemy action, but by the slow grinding attrition of logistical inadequacy. He had discovered what it meant to fight enemies who could deliver ice cream to tropical jungles, while Japanese forces ate grass and waited to die. The lesson was clear to anyone willing to examine it honestly. Modern warfare was decided by logistics, by industrial capacity expressed through supply systems that kept soldiers fed, equipped, and capable of sustained operations. Tactical skill mattered, courage mattered, training and discipline mattered, but none of it mattered enough when soldiers were starving and their opponents were eating 4,000 calories daily while receiving regular resupply of ammunition, medicine, and equipment. Japan had challenged the United States, believing that superior spirit would overcome material disadvantages, that disciplined Japanese soldiers could defeat soft Americans dependent on comfort and machinery. This belief was tested across the Pacific from 1941 through 1945. It failed comprehensively. American soldiers proved neither soft nor lacking in fighting spirit. They were simply better supplied, better fed, and operating within logistics systems that Japan could not match and could not disrupt effectively enough to matter. The captured K-ration boxes Yoshida had examined at Sepik River represented more than emergency food. They represented industrial civilization, capable of projecting power across oceans, sustaining armies on distant continents, and fighting extended wars without worrying whether soldiers would eat. The Americans were not just outproducing Japan in tanks and aircraft. They were outfeeding Japan in calories and nutrients, maintaining combat effectiveness through abundance, while Japanese forces weakened through scarcity. 60% of Japanese military deaths during the Pacific War resulted not from combat, but from starvation and disease. Approximately 1.4 million soldiers died away from battlefields, succumbing to privations that reduced them below the threshold of survival. These men were killed by logistics failures, as surely as if bullets or bombs had struck them. The difference was that their deaths occurred slowly, over weeks and months of grinding decline that destroyed bodies and spirits before extinguishing lives. American military planners learned from Pacific warfare that logistics constituted combat power equal to firepower or maneuver. The ability to deliver supplies reliably determined what operations were possible and sustainable. Future conflicts would reflect these lessons, with logistics receiving emphasis as a core competency rather than an administrative afterthought. The axiom that armies march on their stomachs, often attributed to Napoleon, proved true in the Pacific with scientific precision. Feed your soldiers adequately, and they fight effectively. Starve your soldiers, and they lose, regardless of courage or skill. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.